does not predict directional change in trait frequencies, and it is more pronounced in small populations. Big words. Let me explain it in a more simplistic sense. There could have been random events, right? There could have been random events that decreased the occurrence of genes, and these genes were fitness enhancing. And since they decreased, then there was an increase of genes, right, that were not fitness enhancing, but they increased over time. And they increased so much that the genes that were more fitness enhancing disappeared. They got extinct. And therefore natural selection had no choice but to choose the ones that were less fitness enhancing. As Catterbuck in 2015 says, and I think it's a female scholar, I forgot her first name, it's in the bibliography, so I do apologize if I got her gender wrong. She says the following, she gives a good example. Consider a population of mice in a field that is occasionally and randomly hit by lightning strikes. And a lightning strike is a random event. The population contains two types of mice, brown-coated and white-coated, that are otherwise physically identical. Coat color is irrelevant to susceptibility to lightning strikes. Types breed true and the population size is constant. At time k, suppose there are 6 brown-coated and 4 white-coated mice. So the trait frequencies are 0.6 brown and 0.4 white. Lightning then strikes the field at random, killing 1 white-coated mouse. At time k plus 1, the population contains 6 brown-coated mice and 3 white-coated. So the trait frequencies have changed to 0.67 brown to 0.33 white. The mice then reproduce until the population size returns to 10, at which point the expectation is that there will be 6.7 brown and 3.3 white mice. Now, what's the implication of genetic drift on evolutionary reliabilism? Now listen to this very carefully. Given the role that genetic drift plays in the evolution of a population, our cognitive faculties, right, could have been favored by natural selection based on constraints caused by random events that affected the frequency of specific traits in a population. Listen very carefully. A random event may have increased the frequency of traits that developed cognitive faculties that were not reliable. The frequency of these traits may have increased, and under such constraints, natural selection favored these traits. That is, they were able to flourish in a given population, even though these traits may have not been optimal for survival and reproduction. If genetic drift constrained natural selection in this way, and it is fundamentally random, then I would argue we have to be skeptical about the reliability of our true beliefs. Because if it's true that genetic drift is a mechanism to explain biological change, in conjunction with natural selection, then it could be the case that a random event made the trait, which is truth, reliable cognitive faculties, disappear. And all we're left with were unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs that still led to fitness and they were still fitness enhancing, and they still led to survival and reproduction. However, they were not optimal. But the optimal one disappeared because of a random event. So when you put genetic drift into the equation, which from my reading in the academic philosophical discourse, they don't really mention this. It's a novel argument, right? Because they always rely just on natural selection. But we've moved on. It's not just about natural selection anymore, it's also about genetic drift. And if genetic drift has some type of a constraint to natural selection, which yes, I agree there's some debate, but people are not disagreeing with the fact that genetic drift does play a role, and it is fundamentally random, where it could be the case that there was a random event that made the trait of truth, reliable cognitive faculties disappear, and basically the trait that flourished was the one that basically was based on unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs, right? So it could be that unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs just basically it flourished because the one that was more optimal, for argument's sake, disappeared because of the random event. So, let me now move on to Michael Deem and epistemic privilege. The reason I'm mentioning Michael Deem because my postgrad academic paper was on challenging Michael Deem. And in actual fact, I agree with him. I don't want to get into the nuances of his discussion because Michael Deem wrote a paper against Stitch and Plantinga. So Stitch and Plantinga have an argument against evolutionary reliabilism, or have an argument against philosophical naturalism, and an argument against Darwinism, that you can provide a basis for truth-bearing cognitive faculties. That's in essence, right? So what Deem does, he attacks their arguments, and I think he does a good job. And I think Stitch and Plantinga go too far, but I don't want to discuss the details. What I want to discuss here is his type of conclusion. So the interesting thing about Deem, and because it's a recent academic paper in 2018, I've given you the details in the bibliography, that he argues that, yes, evolutionary reliabilism cannot demonstrate that there is a necessary link between natural selection and truth-reliable cognitive faculties. So he agrees with this, right? However, he says that the arguments against evolutionary reliabilism do not succeed, because in order for them to succeed, they have to basically provide some kind of empirical evidence, right? But even considering this, Deem argues that yes, evolutionary reliabilism doesn't entail a necessary connection between selective pressures and cognitive reliability, but he argues advocates for ER, for evolutionary reliabilism, can continue to support it. But why? Why the epistemic privilege? Why has he privileged evolutionary reliabilism over anything else? Why the privilege? Especially since evolution has a hard task in explaining consciousness, has a hard task in explaining language, right? So, and these things are somewhat related. So why give it epistemic privilege? Especially as he admits that there's no empirical evidence. Or if there is empirical evidence, it's not strong enough. Do you see my point? So Deem's argument against the challenges against the ER, the challenges against ER, basically he argues that in order for the challenges against ER to be valid, they need to be a little bit more specific and provide some kind of empirical evidence. But in absence of that, he said we could still hold on to ER. But there's a problem. The door swings both ways. Because you have to also justify your position, and he even concedes this in his own paper. He says it is not sufficient to justify ER. So he makes an admission. Even though Deem's response undermines specific challenges to ER, in this case Stitch and Plantinga, and seems to give ER epistemic privilege, he concedes his argument is not sufficient to justify evolutionary reliabilism. And he says in his conclusion that we need more empirical evidence. And he cites some empirical evidence, and I've got the books here for you. He cites The Evolved Apprentice, How Evolution Made Humans Unique, Thought in a Hostile World, it's in his bibliography, and Complexity and Function of the Mind in Nature. He cites these, and he says these are, interesting kind of empirical models that we could work with. But they're just empirical models. But what he doesn't understand is that there is no strong empirical evidence to justify ER, right? And obviously this applies to non-ER approaches too. But there are some examples, so I've given you some examples that are empirical type research that supports evolutionary reliabilism, and there are some examples against. But I want to focus on something which is a relatively recent paper in 2013, and it's research by Donald Hoffman, Manish Singh, and Justin Mark. And they basically argue, they try to answer the question, which is the title of the paper, does evolution favor true perceptions? I've got the paper here, and I've got loads of other papers for you to see that are based on the bibliography. So you can't accuse me of making things up here. So their paper is really interesting, because this is what they argue. They basically say that true perceptions, so an organism to have true perceptions could have made an organism less fit. Let me repeat what I'm saying. This is quite damning research if it's true and if it's repeatable, right? True perceptions could have made an organism less fit. If that's the case, natural selection would not choose an organism that has true perceptions. This is damning. This is damning not only on cognitive faculties, it's damning to empiricism itself. Because empiricism relies on that you have true perceptions, right? So this is what they say. And this is a summary of the paper, and I advise you to read it. It's available online. The key point is that fitness is distinct from truth. Organisms that evolve fitter vision systems through natural selection need not, ipso facto, evolve to see truth. If a true perception takes more time or energy to compute, or if it represents aspects of the world that are irrelevant for guiding adaptive behaviors of the organism, then it could adversely affect fitness. The studies thus far, using evolutionary game theory and genetic algorithms, indicate that truer perceptions are not necessarily fitter, and that a simple interface strategy can drive true perceptions into extinction. So there's massive epistemological implications here if this is true, and you adopted if you rely on Darwinism to explain your true perceptions, that you now have to be skeptical about your perceptions, which therefore means, generally speaking, since our cognitive faculties require perceptions to make assessments about things, then you have to be skeptical. And this is empirical evidence based on genetic algorithms and evolutionary game theory, and basically it's indicating that having more true perceptions make you less fit. Therefore, natural selection will not choose the trait that basically is about true perceptions. This is significant. So, what about Islamic theism and truth reliable cognitive faculties? Well, we have it easy, to be honest. We don't really have a problem. God is all-knowing, the wise, the powerful, and the truth. Therefore, it's not unreasonable to come to the conclusion, via His will, knowledge and power, that God gave us truth reliable cognitive faculties. It's actually that simple. So what's the implications for theism versus atheism discussions? Well, I would argue if this is true, then they have to be skeptical. They have to be skeptics, right? Because evolution reliabilism really, in all due respect, cannot be justified. And in absence of empirical evidence, and even if you consider some of the empirical evidence against it, right, and the philosophical evidence that we spoke about thus far, they have to be skeptical. They have to be skeptics. So claims such as God does not exist, if they consider it a knowledge claim, or belief in God is irrational, or there is no proof of God's existence, or religion is irrational, these claims cannot be truth claims anymore. Because they have to be skeptics. They have to adopt skepticism, which is knowledge or truth is not possible to attain or acquire. So that means knowledge or truth is not possible to attain or acquire. That's the skeptical position. So atheists that assume they have truth reliable cognitive faculties negate their own assumption by adopting philosophical naturalism, as we've discussed. They either have to change their assumption, in this case maybe assume skepticism, or change their beliefs about the world. So let's revisit the dialogue we mentioned in the beginning, and hopefully you'll understand it much better. Atheist: there is no evidence for the existence of God. Belief in God is irrational. Muslim: that's an interesting assertion. Before we continue, can I ask you, do you believe that you have reliable cognitive faculties that can produce reliable true beliefs? In other words, do you believe you can reason? Atheist: obviously, any rational person would deny God. There's simply no evidence. Muslim: okay, great. So can I ask, how do you explain your truth reliable cognitive faculties under atheism? Atheist: what do you mean? Muslim: well, do you believe all phenomena can be explained by physical stuff, physical processes? And do you believe that there is no supernatural? Atheist: sure. Muslim: how can you explain your ability to reason if our ability to do so came from seemingly blind physical processes? Atheist: well, we have a brain that has evolved. Muslim: okay, according to atheism, an evolved brain is based on physical stuff too, no? Atheist: yes, but our brains have evolved to be rational, because the more you know about the world, the more likely you are to survive. Muslim: that's not true. Holding false beliefs about the world can lead to survival too. Atheist: yes, but it is more likely that natural selection favored truth-reliable cognitive faculties over unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs. Muslim: where's your evidence for that claim? There's actually philosophical and empirical evidence to undermine your assertion. Atheist: so what? We both assume we have reliable cognitive faculties, so it's not an issue. Muslim: well, for me it isn't, because under atheism your ability to reason does not make sense. You must adopt skepticism if you want to be consistent. Also, atheism has invalidated the very assumption that it claims to use to deny God, having truth reliable cognitive faculties. So it's absurd to be an atheist, since atheism nullifies the ability to reason itself. Atheist, no, you have to prove God to me first. Muslim, that's a cop-out, because your use of the word proof assumes your ability to reason. However, you're not justified in making such an assumption, because believing we have truth's reliable cognitive faculties is nullified under atheism. It could be that we survive due to unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs. From this perspective, atheism is irrational. However, my belief that we are rational makes sense with God's existence. It is not unreasonable to come to the conclusion that God, by His will, knowledge and power, gave us reliable cognitive faculties that produce true beliefs. So here's your bibliography for you to do your further research and continue the story. And we have an early Q&A. So we'll have a Q&A up to Maghrib. We pray Maghrib, we come back and we continue the discussion. So, any questions? Yes, sir.
Thanks for the talk. In layman's terms, how would you summarize this argument with someone if you don't want to use lots of sort of cognitive faculty and because most people you speak on a day-to-day basis will be, if you go into too deep like that, they might not be able to sort of follow what you're saying.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my advice is when people come to these specialist seminars, that they absorb it for themselves, carry on their research, understand it, and then they popularize it in their own work. So there is a purpose to these seminars. It's not meant for everyone. It's meant for people who maybe have, the willingness to want to understand it on this high level, for the intention to basically articulate on the ground. Now, the way I would do it very simply is, well, just like in the dialogue, but in a more simpler sense, I would say, well, do you have, you believe that God doesn't exist? Do you believe you're rational? Yeah, I do believe I'm rational. Well, how can you explain that under atheism? Well, what do you mean? Well, do you believe everything can be explained by physical processes? Yeah, for sure. So how can you have rationality from just blind physical processes? Because physical processes are not direct in any way, right? They don't have an intention behind them, directing themselves to anything, right? And if you believe that, then you're not an atheist anymore, really, because who's doing the directing, right? So the point is they're blind physical processes. But can you have rationality from blind physical processes? No, because what does rationality also mean? It means you can take premises and direct them to a conclusion, right? You get some ideas, you put them together, and you create logical links. How can you justify the logical link if we're just basically, it's based on blind physical processes? It's like a taxi driver, right? Getting 2 passengers and basically saying, hold on a second, where are you going? We're going to Marble Arch. Okay, just bear with me. Puts a blindfold on and starts driving and thinks he's going to go to Marble Arch. That can't be the case. He's not going to go anywhere. It's going to be a disaster, right? Or even a bus driver, just basically putting a blindfold on thinking, yeah, I'm going to take you to Marble Arch. The guy's going to take you to nowhere, right? Similarly, if that's your worldview about physical processes, that there's no intentionality, no direction, they're not directed to a mental conclusion, right? Well, how can you now justify that you can make a logical link between ideas and concepts? How can that be the case? So that's maybe an easy way of putting it. But if someone's involved in this area of work, they would break down some of your assumptions and you have to discuss it at this level. But generally speaking, I'll be like, you know what? An atheist that adopts philosophical naturalism, that everything could be explained by physical processes, all phenomena could be explained by physical processes, and there's no God, is basically equivalent of a blind taxi driver thinking that he's got 2 passengers and he could take them to a destination. That's it, really. But under theism, it's a taxi driver that can see. Because we don't believe the world is blind in that way. It's directed, right? Do you see my point? And that's probably the easiest way of putting it. Taxi drivers and bus drivers, bro. Alright? Any other questions? Yes, brother.
Yes, hi. Thanks for talking. Can we also say that given all the different races and cultures that exist, and they've all flourished, and they've all prospered and survived, so to survive because not all of the religions and all of the different cultures and all the different groups that they have cannot be simultaneously true, like Hinduism, they cannot be all true. So regardless of whatever faith, whatever belief they have, they still survive. So they cannot, the truth and to survive are not inclusive.
Yeah, absolutely. That's actually one of the points. If I go back, it's one of the points against evolution reliabilism, which is about the clusters of beliefs, right? So you can have systems of beliefs that are false, but they lead to behaviors that are fitness enhancing. So natural selection would actually select those false beliefs because they lead to behaviors that are fitness enhancing. So this is exactly the point that James Sage talks about, and he mentions religion actually. Let me just give you the full quote. He basically mentions, I'll read the whole thing for you, right? Another strategy identifies clusters of false beliefs that increase an organism's inclusive fitness. Some such clusters might be religious systems of beliefs. Because, and he says exactly what you're saying, because these various religious systems are incompatible, it follows that many of them are false. Right? Are you James Sage, by the way? Therefore, individuals who accept these systems hold many false beliefs that nevertheless lead to behaviors that increase an individual's inclusive fitness. And then he continues. So well done, bro. That's exactly the point. That was a good insight. I'm quite impressed. Any other questions? Yeah.
You said that most atheists are just philosophical naturalists, yeah?
Yeah.
Meaning that they believe that everything can be proved through naturalism or through natural processes, yeah?
Yeah, all phenomena can be explained in reference to or by physical processes.
Okay. Wouldn't you say that most of them would actually say that it can be, but we haven't discovered all discovered it all yet?
Yeah.
So therefore, if you're going to make an argument to say that how do you account for atheism, and you're using these kind of arguments, and they just not say that we haven't reached that knowledge yet to explain it through natural phenomena. You just haven't reached that knowledge, that knowledge yet, but we may do in the future.
They can say that there is a gap in our understanding of physical processes, therefore we can wait to close the gap. But there's another issue here, because you're assuming that science always closes the gap. It doesn't. Sometimes it makes the gap much wider. And people don't understand this, right? So for example, I think before the 1950s or something, we believed that the cell was a cytoplasm, right? But then when we discovered the DNA and the kind of the city, which is the cell, it's like a city, it created far more problems for us, right? Like how, what's going on here? What about life and stuff like that, right? So it can widen the gap sometimes, especially questions regarding or the significant existential questions relating to existential significance, yeah? But this is not the point here. The point here is we have the scientific evidence. There's a belief that natural selection is true, right? So it's not as if we're going to find out. We're just saying, given that these are the scientific truths we believe to be true, that there's no gap here. We have an explanation. It's Darwinism. It's natural selection. Well, given that's true, well, let's talk about the implications. That's all we're doing. And that's why there's a subtlety here, because someone would quickly just try and smuggle in this kind of science of, there's a gap in our scientific knowledge, and we're gonna close the gap. No, we have the scientific knowledge. Unless you're willing to be skeptical about Darwinism and natural selection, if that's the case, then you've made our point. You see? So what I would say to them is, well, we're not playing with the gap here. We're not saying, oh, there's a gap in knowledge, there's fudging some kind of theism. No. Natural selection is true. Let's talk about the philosophical implications. Right?
Yeah.
You'll talk about evolution reliabilism. Alright, it has some implications. Let's discuss them. And we're just challenging them empirically and philosophically. Do you see my point?
Yeah.
It's not about a gap in our knowledge per se. Now, what they may argue is this. Yeah, but because there's a lack of empirical evidence to justify ER, then given that, science somewhat has going towards a direction of that we can close gaps, then maybe we'll have empirical evidence to close the gap here and provide evidence to justify evolution reliabilism. That is an argument, but here is the problem. The problem is that all empirical conclusions have philosophical baggage and philosophical assumptions. So not only would you have to deal with the empirical data, but you have to deal with the philosophical baggage or the philosophical assumptions that comes with that empirical data. Notwithstanding, it's very important to know that there is empirical evidence to actually show the opposite now, right? So you may have lots of evidence to justify it, but what are you going to do with the evidence that doesn't justify it? So for me, it's still supporting skepticism from that point of view, right? And even if they were true with that assertion, I would say to them, fine. But aren't you supposed to be following the evidence now, what you have now? If now it's telling you to be a skeptic, then be a skeptic then. Be consistent.
Hamza,
Yep.
Can we also say that since we humans, who come from different backgrounds, etc., have failed to come to truth because we have different truths, and we cannot by consensus come together or discover truth, we need something that is beyond us. or another way, i.e. we ourselves, either individually or society, are limited, and we cannot learn everything that is true throughout the universe. So we need something from outside to show
that's a
us.
slightly different discussion, but that's something interesting. I mean, let me just use your question to basically bring maybe a more significant theological point. If it's true that the best way to explain our truth, reliable, cognitive faculties is through theism, that this is all-wise, all-knowing creator that created us with the ability to come to truth, right? Created our truth-bearing cognitive faculties, and if we use them properly, with a sincere heart, we could investigate the world and ourselves and come to the conclusion that God exists and that He's worthy of worship. And what does it mean about praising the Creator? And praise is a form of worship. You know, sometimes we could praise, you know, scientists and praise architects and praise mathematicians, but what about the one who created the architects and the mathematician and the scientists, you know? Sometimes we could praise these things, you know, but the one who created this, right? What kind of extensive praise belongs to the Creator, right? You know, you're like, wow, look at the human mind, it's so amazing, could do such amazing stuff. I agree, but continue. Wow, what does that mean about the one who created the human mind, right? He deserves extensive praise, right? So we should always create the worship link in all of our discourse, even if it's philosophical or abstract or whatever, because we're Muslim and we want to create awakenings within people so they understand this, right? We don't want this to be just like kind of abstract philosophical exercise. We want to, you know, bring it. We want to be real about this. We want to say to them, look, given the fact that under theism it makes more sense to hold the valid assumption that we have truth, reliable cognitive faculties, then, you know, let's investigate our truth, reliable cognitive faculties and look what we can achieve as human beings. It's amazing, isn't it? Human beings are amazing. But who created them? And what does that mean about the one who created them? How amazing is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Allahu Akbar. He is greater, right? So you could praise the human mind because of what it can achieve. What about the one who created the human mind? And you could use this kind of spiritual logic, if you want to call it that, to so many things, right? How can your heart have peace if you don't connect with the one who created your heart in the first place? Questions?
Do you have like more empirical evidence proof that sort of selection actually favoured false belief?
Okay, very good question. So the brother's asking, do we have empirical evidence that natural selection favoured unreliable cognitive faculties that produce false beliefs? Look, at the moment the empirical evidence is not great, right? From my understanding, but you need to investigate further yourself. What I would suggest is this. There is arguments, for example, the one that I spoke about, Hoffman, Singh and Mark, and they talk about does evolution favour true perception, and their current conclusion is saying, based on genetic algorithms and evolutionary game theory, that actually having true perception is basically has a biological cost, right? So it doesn't make you fitter. So natural selection could choose a trait that basically is based on false perceptions, right? And they have, I think Hoffman Stevens and Hoffman have a more up-to-date, lengthier piece. It's called "Fitness Beats Truth in the Evolution of Perception." So there's a lot of academic work concerning that, based on statistical analysis and stuff like that. So there is a lot of, well, I wouldn't say a lot, but there is empirical evidence to show that actually natural selection favored unreliable cognitive faculties to produce false beliefs, which has massive implications, right? But this is not the point. We're relying, that's why I mentioned genetic drift. Because even if there was empirical evidence solely focusing on natural selection, it's not telling the full story. Because you also have genetic drift. Now, whether you think genetic drift is a massive constraint to natural selection or not, that's a different discussion, but no one denies that genetic drift exists, right? And it's a mechanism. So it could be the case that a random event, right, basically made extinct the trait that was that was that basically was about truth, reliable cognitive faculties, and that the only trait that was left was unreliable cognitive faculties. And fine, maybe it wasn't optimal, right, from a biological fitness point of view, but that's all we had. So natural selection, based on the random event via genetic drift, would have to select unreliable cognitive faculties. If you put that into the equation, I don't know how the empirical data can unravel all of that. For me, I think it's impossible. I mean, as a philosopher, what I would argue is probably impossible. Because even when you read the books that try to find an empirical model, they're just models, right? And they have their own philosophical assumptions anyway. And you see this with most empirical models, even when it comes to consciousness, right? Like Professor Antti Ravonsio, who's a philosopher of the mind, when he looks at empirical models, or empirical theoretical frameworks, if you like, to explain consciousness, he says, but they all have philosophical assumptions anyway that cannot be proven by science. They have to assume them. Do you see? So I would argue the empirical evidence is not going to get us anywhere, and I think they just have to be skeptics. Right? And this changes the discourse between Muslims and atheists. You don't have to now start justifying why you believe in God from that point of view. Don't get me wrong, we do have good arguments. But the point is, just turn the tables. Right? You believe you're rational? Okay, prove to me. Under philosophical natural, does rationality make sense? Does it make sense? Right? Just have this discussion. Yes.
Just to kind of go along with the point that you just said, I feel that proving that you're able to rationalise or that you have cognitive abilities is probably more important from an atheist point of view in order to be able to argue that point. But from someone who has faith, we know that there are people who don't have cognitive abilities. Either they're born with, cognitive problems that they can't actually reason, or they lose their cognitive abilities, they'll get dementia. But yet they're still able to maintain their faith, despite the fact that they're not able to reason or don't have a cognitive pathway to reach true beliefs or to reach true facts. So I think from a believing point of view, you don't actually need cognitive abilities in order to support your faith or your belief, because there are other things that are responsible for someone being able to believe in God.
Yeah, it's deep, absolutely.
Whereas an atheist needs, if you're an atheist and then you get dementia, are you still an atheist because you can't argue that point? You don't have that ability.
Okay.
So.
Well, it depends if the atheist would argue that atheism is a knowledge claim. So if it's not a knowledge claim, then they would say maybe the default position is atheism, but that's a massive different discussion. But just unraveling your point, it's true. See, everything has first principles. We did a seminar series on this, and first principles are like these necessary ideas or concepts that you require in order for a sphere of knowledge to grow. But yet those first principles you can't really prove. And this exists in everything. Science, philosophy, mathematics. Like in the philosophy of the maths, you have this principle, this assumption, infinities exist. Can't prove it, you have to start with it in order for you to have calculus or set theory, right? In science, you have to have the assumption that nature is uniform. In neuroscience, you have to somehow believe that neurochemicals firing is identical in some way explains inner subjective conscious states, which is an assumption of physicalism, which is not a scientific assumption, it's a philosophical one, which they can't prove. They have to do philosophical discussions. So everything has first principles. One of our first principles is we have a fitrah. The fitrah is the innate disposition that God created within us, and we have proto-knowledge, forms of primary knowledge within the fitrah, which is that God exists and that He deserves extensive praise. Based on the various traditions, you could infer that basically this natural state gets clouded, right? So, and there are different ways to uncloud your natural state to awaken the truth within. Reason is one of them, but it's not the only one. And it might not work for some people. It might be actually buying someone a pizza. Honestly, and trust me, I've discussed with enough atheists all around the world to come to the conclusion that it's very rare that I found someone who has a decent philosophical rational position, even when they came with a philosophical rational position. I remember I had a Pakistani atheist who did quantum physics or something, came to me after a university election. He says, Hamza, and obviously I'm paraphrasing the story, it was a while ago, but the essence of it is in this narrative. He basically said, your argument for God's existence doesn't make sense because causality doesn't make sense out of the universe. Now, I could have been more arrogant than I usually am, may Allah forgive me, and I could have said, well, you have an empirical presupposition that causality is derived from your experience, but it's actually the other way around. Causality is a priori, it's prior to experience. It's necessary to understand any experience, and I can go into this massive philosophical, crazy discussion. But we have to be intellectually and spiritually mature to understand that they already have the truth within them. How do you now uncloud their fitrah, their innate disposition? So from some experience, I just said to him, look, what do you mean by causality? To cut a long story short, he didn't know. Because if you study Western philosophy, causality is not really dealt with yet. The nature of the causal link is like, woohoo, right? So I said to him, isn't it interesting that you're using a key word in a sentence to undermine God and you don't even know what that key word means? What's wrong with it? Let's sit down. So we sat down. You know what his major problem was? Spiritual. Nothing to do. But he veiled it in some kind of quasi-intellectual sense, right? But it wasn't. No, don't get me wrong. There are some intellectual issues, for sure, that we need to address. But if we have the right model of what the human being is, that they have it within them already. They have the truth within them, right? They have the truth. That's why sometimes I get accused of being a little bit, Hamza, you're not harsh enough anymore to atheists, bro. You know, what's wrong with you? I was like, because, I mean, they already have it in them. Every human being has the truth. We just have to plant the seed. We have to help them uncloud the innate disposition to awaken the truth within. And, you know, you don't always have to be like, you know, 1 + 1 is equal to 2 in a theological sense. You just help them go on their journey. And sometimes it's not answering the question. Now, I could have answered it philosophically, but that would have lost him. Do you see? He would have just given me another question. But we have to like find out what's going on within and help them, right? With humility, of course, yeah. So another example that was quite interesting is, you know, someone in my town said, oh, I saw your debate with Krauss, it was very good, but I'm still an atheist. I didn't even address him. I said, how's your parents? I think he spent about 10 minutes talking about the issues he has at home. I was like, wow, that was, you know, you see my point. And this happens all the time, honestly. I had another person who was great at algorithms, working for an amazing IT company, and he was like, you know, consciousness, and I know this and that, and I don't think he realized that I did my postgrad specializing in consciousness, right? And, you know, he was giving me some kind of like undergrad argument, and I was responding to him, and he was saying that AI can be conscious, artificial intelligence, you know, would be like a human being. I was like, wow, that's really interesting. And I said, well, there's a difference between strong AI and weak AI. I talked about Professor John Searle. We went into this philosophical discussion. But it was nice. We were going through this discussion. At the end, I said to him, look, what's your main problem? He said, well, I don't believe in God, man, because God has human-like attributes, right? I was like, okay, that's very interesting. But you know, Allah, you know, we say, the Quran says, Allah says, laysa kamithlihi shay. There's nothing like God. He's transcendent, and you know his names and attributes are maximally perfect without any deficiency and flaw. And we have flaws, and it's not the same. It's not human-like attributes. He said, yeah, but they sound very human, kind of thing. And basically, that was the essence of the discussion, not word for word, but that was the discussion. And then I think I caught him there because I realized there was a logical contradiction in his previous assertion and his current assertion, because the door swings both ways. The logical door swings both ways. He was okay with AI having human-like attributes, but not the other way around, kind of thing, right? And then, you know, usually when you have these kind of contradictions, it's an indication for some psychological issue. And what I mean by psychological, not that, oh, they're sick. No, not at all. But they've had something in their past or in their life that has made them provide false intellectual filters to come to false conclusions. So I try to be humble and relate to my own history with my father and say, you know, sometimes when we think we have true perceptions about somebody or something, and because of the negative experiences or the false baggage that we have, and you know, we have a drama, and in reality we think our drama is the same as reality, but our drama is based on our limited perceptions and experiences and all that stuff. And I talked about my father, then I slightly suggested maybe that could be the case with you, and he was a soft, nice kid. Do you know what happened? He's aggressive all of a sudden. He's like, pressed a button. He went up and he was like, how dare you, kind of thing. He was crying. I was like, whoa. And inside he was like, okay, I know what's going on here, right? And his mother actually confirmed, because some other brother was in the room as well, and his mother confirmed that he had a lot of issues with father figures and stuff, right? Maybe that's not the case, but generally speaking, when you understand what the human being is as the human being, because the human being is not a functional model, it's not a computer that you type in an algorithm, you expect some kind of results. Allah created the human being, He knows the human being better than we do. The human being is a ruh, is a soul, is a qalb, is a heart, a spiritual heart, is an aql. And the aql, the intellect, is a function of the heart according to the scholars. And we have a nafs, and we have a fitra. That's the human being. And these things are dynamic interplay. So why do we discourse with human beings as if they're just like rational? Don't get me wrong, I know this seminar is very rational type, but you get the point. I don't want you to see this seminar through those lenses. I want you to see this through the lenses of, right, if we come across a human being that may have a cloud over their innate disposition that may be this, then I can use this. But you know what? Maybe you could just throw what I've said today in the bin. These are just tools for you. But we need to have intellectual and spiritual maturity to understand, like, how do I help uncloud that person's innate disposition? And it might not be this at all. It might just be buying the pizza, honestly. Or it might just basically just listening, you know, with the intention to understand someone. Or it might be just having good akhlaq and adab, good manners and morals. It might be just showing them what Islam does for you in your life, right? It might be just clarifying some basic misconceptions. It might be just teaching them how to pray. Well, before I became Muslim, I used to pray. That was fundamental for me to become Muslim, you know? It wasn't this intellectual gymnastics, although some of it was there, but if you were to give me the arguments that I knew like 16 years ago, I'll probably laugh at myself now. Do you see my point? So, you know, so your question is so fundamental. Your point was, that's it, this is it, absolutely. So look, let's go upstairs and pray Maghrib. Then we come back and we continue the discussion, okay?